Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, thought in Chinese, Tangzhou, or Tang Empire, was an imperial dynasty of China that ruled from 618 to 907 AD, with an interregnum between 690 and 705. It was preceded by the Sui dynasty and followed by the five dynasties in 10 kingdoms period. Historians generally regard the Tang as a high point in Chinese civilization and a golden age of cosmopolitan culture. Tang territory, acquired through the military campaigns of its early rulers, rivaled that of the Han dynasty. The Lai family founded the dynasty, seizing power during the decline and collapse of the Sui Empire and inaugurating a period of progress and stability in the first half of the dynasty's rule. The dynasty was formally interrupted during 690–705 when Empress Wu Zetian seized the throne, proclaiming the Wu Zhou dynasty and becoming the only legitimate Chinese empress regnant. The devastating An Lushan Rebellion 755–763 shook the nation and led to the decline of central authority in the dynasty's latter half. Like the previous Sui dynasty, the Tang maintained a civil service system by recruiting scholar officials through standardized examinations and recommendations to office. The rise of regional military governors known as jiedushi during the 9th century undermined this civil order. The dynasty and central government went into decline by the latter half of the 9th century. Agrarian rebellions resulted in mass population loss and displacement, widespread poverty, and further government dysfunction that ultimately ended the dynasty in 907. The Tang capital at Chang'an in present-day Xi'an was then the world's most populous city. Two censuses of the 7th and 8th centuries estimated the empire's population at about 50 million people, which grew to an estimated 80 million by the dynasty's end. From its numerous subjects, the dynasty raised professional and conscripted armies of hundreds of thousands of troops to contend with nomadic powers for control of Inner Asia and the lucrative trade routes along the Silk Road. Far-flung kingdoms and states paid tribute to the Tang court, while the Tang also indirectly controlled several regions through a protectorate system. In addition to its political hegemony, the Tang exerted a powerful cultural influence over neighboring East Asian nations such as Japan and Korea. Chinese culture flourished and further matured during the Tang era. It is traditionally considered the greatest age for Chinese poetry. Two of China's most famous poets, Lai Bai and Du Fu, belonged to this age, contributing with poets such as Wang Wei to the monumental 300 Tang poems. Many famous painters such as Han Gan, Zhang Xuan, and Zhu Fang were active, while Chinese court music flourished with instruments such as the popular pipa. Tang scholars compiled a rich variety of historical literature, as well as encyclopedias and geographical works. Notable innovations included the development of woodblock printing. Buddhism became a major influence in Chinese culture, with native Chinese sects gaining prominence. However, in the 840s, Emperor Wu Zhou enacted policies to suppress Buddhism, which subsequently declined in influence. History. Establishment. The Lai family belonged to the Northwest military aristocracy prevalent during the Sui dynasty and claimed to be paternally descended from the Taoist founder, Lao Tzu, whose personal name was Lai Dan or Liar, the Han dynasty general Lai Guang, and founder of Han Chinese Kingdom Western Liang ruler Lai Gao. This family was known as the Longxi Lai lineage, Longzai Lai Shi, which includes the Tang poet Lai Bai. The Tang emperors also had part Xianbei maternal ancestry from Emperor Gaozu of Tang's Xianbei mother, Duchess Dugu. Lai Yuan was Duke of Tang and governor of Taiyuan, modern Shaanxi, during the Sui dynasty's collapse, which was caused in part by the Sui failure to conquer the northern part of the Korean peninsula during the Goguryeo-Sui War. He had prestige and military experience and was a first cousin of Emperor Yang of Sui. Their mothers were sisters. Lai Yuan rose in rebellion in 617 along with his son and his equally militant daughter Princess Pingying d. 623, who raised and commanded her own troops. In winter 617, Lai Yuan occupied Chang'an, relegated Emperor Yang to the position of Taixing Huang or retired emperor, and acted as regent to the puppet child Emperor Yang Yu. On the news of Emperor Yang's murder by General Yuan Huaji on June 618, Lai Yuan declared himself the emperor of a new dynasty, Tang. Lai Yuan, known as Emperor Geazu of Tang, ruled until 626, when he was forcefully deposed by his son Lai Shimin, the Prince of Qin. Lai Shimin had commanded troops since the age of 18 years old, had prowess with bow and arrow, sword and lance, and was known for his effective cavalry charges. Fighting a numerically superior army, he defeated Du Jian 573-621 at Luoyang in the Battle of Hilao on May 28, 621. In a violent elimination of royal family due to fear of assassination, Lai Shimin ambushed and killed two of his brothers, Lai Yuanji b. 603 and Crown Prince Lai Jiancheng b. 589, in the Xuanwu Gate incident on July 2, 626. Shortly thereafter, his father abdicated in his favor, and Lai Shimin ascended the throne. He is conventionally known by his temple name Taizong. Although killing two brothers and deposing his father contradicted the Confucian value of filial piety, Taizong showed himself to be a capable leader who listened to the advice of the wisest members of his council. In 608, Emperor Taizong held a Buddhist memorial service for the casualties of war, and in 629 he had Buddhist monasteries erected at the sites of major battles so that monks could pray for the fallen on both sides of the fight. During the Tang campaign against the Eastern Turks, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate was destroyed after the capture of its ruler, Ilig Khagan, by the famed Tang military officer Lai Jing 571-649, who later became a chancellor of the Tang dynasty. With this victory, the Turks accepted Taizong as their Khagan, a title rendered as Tang-Kehin in addition to his rule as Emperor of China under the traditional title Son of Heaven. Taizong was succeeded by his son Lai Zhai as Emperor Gaozong in 649 CE. The Tang dynasty further led the Tang campaigns against the Western Turks. Early military conflicts were a result of the Tang interventions in the rivalry between the Western and Eastern Turks in order to weaken both. Under Emperor Taizong, campaigns were dispatched in the western regions against Gaochang in 640, Karasar in 644, and 648, and Kucha in 648. The wars against the Western Turks continued under Emperor Gaozong, and the Western Turkic Khaganate was finally annexed after General Su Tingfeng's defeat of Khagan Ashina-Halu in 657 CE. Wu Zetian's usurpation. Although she entered Emperor Gaozong's court as the lowly consort, Wu Zetian rose to the highest seat of power in 690, establishing the short-lived Wu Zhou. Empress Wu's rise to power was achieved through cruel and calculating tactics. A popular conspiracy theory stated that she killed her own baby girl and blamed it on Gaozong's Empress so that the Empress would be demoted. Emperor Gaozong suffered a stroke in 655, and Wu began to make many of his court decisions for him, discussing affairs of state with his counselors, who took orders from her while she sat behind a screen. When Empress Wu's eldest son, the Crown Prince, began to assert his authority and advocate policies opposed by Empress Wu, he suddenly died in 675. Many suspected he was poisoned by Empress Wu. Although the next heir apparent kept a lower profile, in 680 he was accused by Wu of plotting a rebellion. He was then banished and later obliged to commit suicide. In 683, Emperor Gaozong died. He was succeeded by Emperor Zhongzong, his eldest surviving son by Wu. Zhongzong tried to appoint his wife's father as chancellor. After only 6 weeks on the throne, he was deposed by Empress Wu in favor of his younger brother, Emperor Ruozong. This provoked a group of Tang princes to rebel in 684. Wu's army suppressed them within 2 months. She proclaimed the Tanshu era of Wu Zhou on October 16, 690, and 3 days later demoted Emperor Ruozong to crown prince. He was also forced to give up his father's surname Lai in favor of the Empress Wu. She then ruled as China's only Empress regnant. A palace coup on February 20, 705, forced Empress Wu to yield her position on February 22. The next day, her son Zhongzong was restored to power. The Tang was formally restored on March 3. She died soon after. To legitimize her rule, she circulated a document known as the Great Cloud Sutra, which predicted that a reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha would be a female monarch who would dispel illness, worry, and disaster from the world. She even introduced numerous revised written characters to the written language, which reverted to the originals after her death. Arguably, the most important part of her legacy was diminishing the hegemony of the northwestern aristocracy, allowing people from other clans and regions of China to become more represented in Chinese politics and government. Emperor Xuanzong's reign. There were many prominent women at court during and after Wu's reign, including Shang Yuanwan'er 664–710, a poet, writer, and trusted official in charge of Wu's private office. In 706, the wife of Emperor Zhongzong of Tang, Empress Wu d. 710, persuaded her husband to staff government offices with his sister and her daughters, and in 709 requested that he grant women the right to bequeath hereditary privileges to their sons, which before was a male right only. Empress Wu eventually poisoned Zhongzong, whereupon she placed his 15-year-old son upon the throne in 710. 2 weeks later, Lai Longji, the later Emperor Xuanzong, entered the palace with a few followers and slew Empress Wu and her faction. He then installed his father Emperor Ruizong R. 710–712 on the throne. Just as Emperor Zhongzong was dominated by Empress Wu, so too was Ruizong dominated by Princess Taiping. This was finally ended when Princess Taiping's coup failed. In 712 she later hanged herself. In 713 and Emperor Ruizong abdicated to Emperor Xuanzong. During the 44-year reign of Emperor Xuanzong, the Tang dynasty reached its height, a golden age with low economic inflation and a toned-down lifestyle for the imperial court. Seen as a progressive and benevolent ruler, Xuanzong even abolished the death penalty in the year 747. All executions had to be approved beforehand by the emperor himself. These were relatively few, considering that there were only 24 executions in the year 730. Xuanzong bowed to the consensus of his ministers on policy decisions and made efforts to staff government ministries fairly with different political factions. His staunch Confucian chancellor Zhang Juling 673–740 worked to reduce deflation and increase the money supply by upholding the use of private coinage, while his aristocratic and technocratic successor Lai Linfu d. 753 favored government monopoly over the issuance of coinage. After 737, most of Xuanzong's confidence rested in his long-standing chancellor Lai Linfu, who championed a more aggressive foreign policy employing non-Chinese generals. This policy ultimately created the conditions for a massive rebellion against Xuanzong. An Lushan Rebellion and catastrophe. The Tang Empire was at its height of power up until the middle of the 8th century, when the An Lushan Rebellion December 16, 755 February 17, 763 destroyed the prosperity of the empire. An Lushan was a half-Sogdian, half-Turk Tang commander since 744, had experience fighting the Khitans of Manchuria, with a victory in 744, yet most of his campaigns against the Khitans were unsuccessful. He was given great responsibility in Hebei, which allowed him to rebel with an army of more than 100,000 troops. After capturing Luoyang, he named himself emperor of a new, but short-lived, Yan state. Despite early victories scored by Tang General Guozi 697–781, the newly recruited troops of the army at the capital were no match for An Lushan's frontier veterans, so the court fled Chang'an. While the heir apparent raised troops in Shaanxi and Xuanzong fled to Sichuan province, they called upon the help of the Uyghur Khaganate in 756. The Uyghur Khan Moyanshur was greatly excited at this prospect, and married his own daughter to the Chinese diplomatic envoy once he arrived, receiving in turn a Chinese princess as his bride. The Uyghurs helped recapture the Tang capital from the rebels, but they refused to leave until the Tang paid them an enormous sum of tribute in silk. Even Abbasid Arabs assisted the Tang in putting down An Lushan's rebellion. The Tibetans took hold of the opportunity and raided many areas under Chinese control, and even after the Tibetan Empire had fallen apart in 842 and the Uyghurs soon after the Tang were in no position to reconquer Central Asia after 763. So significant was this loss that half a century later Jinshi examination candidates were required to write an essay on the causes of the Tang's decline. Although An Lushan was killed by one of his eunuchs in 757, this time of troubles and widespread insurrection continued until rebel Shi Siming was killed by his own son in 763. One of the legacies that the Tang government left since 710 was the gradual rise of regional military governors, the jiedushi, who slowly came to challenge the power of the central government. After the An Lushan Rebellion, the autonomous power and authority accumulated by the jiedushi in Hebei went beyond the central government's control. After a series of rebellions between 781 and 784 in today's Hebei, Shandong, Hubei and Henan provinces, the government had to officially acknowledge the jiedushi's hereditary ruling without accreditation. The Tang government relied on these governors and their armies for protection and to suppress locals that would take up arms against the government. In return, the central government would acknowledge the rights of these governors to maintain their army, collect taxes, and even to pass on their title to heirs. As time passed, these military governors slowly phased out the prominence of civil officials drafted by exams and became more autonomous from central authority. The rule of these powerful military governors lasted until 960, when a new civil order under the Song dynasty was established. Also, the abandonment of the equal field system meant that people could buy and sell land freely. Many poor fell into debt because of this, forced to sell their land to the wealthy, which led to the exponential growth of large estates. With the breakdown of the land allocation system after 755, the central Chinese state barely interfered in agricultural management and acted merely as tax collector for roughly a millennium, save a few instances such as the Song's failed land nationalization during the 13th century war with the Mongols. With the central government collapsing in authority over the various regions of the empire, it was recorded in 845 that bandits and river pirates in parties of 100 or more began plundering settlements along the Yangtze River with little resistance. In 858, massive floods along the Grand Canal inundated vast tracts of land and terrain of the North China Plain, which drowned tens of thousands of people in the process. The Chinese belief in the mandate of heaven granted to the ailing Tang was also challenged when natural calamities occurred. Furthermore, in 873, a disastrous harvest shook the foundations of the empire. In some areas only half of all agricultural produce was gathered, and tens of thousands faced famine and starvation. In the earlier period of the Tang, the central government was able to meet crises in the harvest, as it was recorded from 714 to 719 that the Tang government responded effectively to natural disasters by extending the price regulation granary system throughout the country. The central government was able then to build a large surplus stock of foods to ward off the rising danger of famine and increased agricultural productivity through land reclamation. In the 9th century, however, the Tang government was nearly helpless in dealing with any calamity. Rebuilding and recovery. End of the dynasty. In addition to natural calamities and jiedushi amassing autonomous control, the Huangqiao Rebellion 874–884 resulted in the sacking of both Chang'an and Luoyang and took an entire decade to suppress. The Tang never recovered from this rebellion, weakening it for future military powers to replace it. Large groups of bandits in the size of small armies ravaged the countryside in the last years of the Tang. They smuggled illicit salt, ambushed merchants and convoys, and even besieged several walled cities. Amid the sacking of cities and murderous factional strife among eunuchs and officials, the top tier of aristocratic families, which had amassed a large fraction of the landed wealth and official positions, was largely destroyed or marginalized. During the last 2 decades of the Tang dynasty, the gradual collapse of central authority led to the rise of two prominent rival military figures over northern China, Li Qiang and Zhu Wen. Tang forces had defeated Huang's rebellion with the crucial aid of allied Shatuo-Turkic peoples of what is now Shaanxi led by Li Qiang. He was made a jiedushi governor and later Prince of Jin, bestowed with the imperial surname Li by the Tang court. Zhu Wen, originally a salt smuggler who served as a lieutenant under the rebel Huang, surrendered to Tang forces. By helping to defeat Huang, he was renamed Zhu Quanzhong of perfect loyalty and granted a series of rapid military promotions to military governor of Xuanwu Circuit. In 901, from his power base of Kaifeng, Zhu Wen seized control of the Tang capital Chang'an and with it the imperial family. By 903, he forced Emperor Zheozong of Tang to move the capital to Luoyang, preparing to take the throne for himself. In 904, Zhu assassinated Emperor Zheozong to replace him with the emperor's young son Emperor Ai of Tang. In 905, Zhu executed the brothers of Emperor Ai, as well as many officials and Empress Dowager He. In 907, the Tang dynasty was ended when Zhu deposed Ai and took the throne for himself, known posthumously as Emperor Taizu of Later Liang. He established the Later Liang, which inaugurated the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. A year later, Zhu had the deposed Emperor Ai poisoned to death. Zhu Wen's hated nemesis Li Qiang died in 908, but, out of loyalty to Tang, Li never claimed the title of emperor. His son Li Kongsu Emperor Zhuangzong inherited his title Prince of Jin along with his father's rivalry against Zhu. In 923, Li Kongsu declared a restored Tang dynasty, the later Tang, before toppling the later Liang dynasty the same year. However, southern China would remain splintered into various small kingdoms until most of China was reunified under the Song dynasty 960–1279. Control over parts of northeast China and Manchuria by the Liao dynasty of the Khitan people also stemmed from this period. In 905, their leader Abayaji formed a military alliance with Li Qiang against Zhu Wen, but the Khitans eventually turned against the later Tang, helping another Shatuo leader, Shi Jingtang of later Jin, to overthrow later Tang in 936. Administration and politics. Politics. Initial reforms. Taizong set out to solve internal problems within the government which had constantly plagued past dynasties. Building upon the Sui legal code, he issued a new legal code that subsequent Chinese dynasties would model theirs upon, as well as neighboring polities in Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. The earliest law code to survive was the one established in the year 653, which was divided into 500 articles specifying different crimes and penalties ranging from 10 blows with a light stick, 100 blows with a heavy rod, exile, penal servitude, or execution. The legal code distinguished different levels of severity in meted punishments when different members of the social and political hierarchy committed the same crime. For example, the severity of punishment was different when a servant or nephew killed a master or an uncle than when a master or uncle killed a servant or nephew. The Tang Code was largely retained by later codes, such as the early Ming Dynasty 1368–1644 Code of 1397, yet there were several revisions in later times, such as improved property rights for women during the Song Dynasty 960–1279. The Tang had 3 departments: Chinese, Sheng, Pinyin Sheng, which were obliged to draft, review, and implement policies respectively. There were also 6 ministries: Chinese, Bu, Pinyin, Bu, under the administrations that implemented policy, each of which was assigned different tasks. These 3 departments and 6 ministries included the personnel administration, finance, rights, military, justice, and public works, an administrative model which would last until the fall of the Qing dynasty 1644–1912. Although the founders of the Tang related to the glory of the earlier Han dynasty 3rd century BC 3rd century AD, the basis for much of their administrative organization was very similar to the previous northern and southern dynasties. The northern Zhou 6th century fubing system of divisional militia was continued by the Tang, along with farmer soldiers serving in rotation from the capital or frontier in order to receive appropriated farmland. The equal field system of the northern Wei 4th–6th centuries was also kept, although there were a few modifications. Although the central and local governments kept an enormous number of records about land property in order to assess taxes, it became common practice in the Tang for literate and affluent people to create their own private documents and signed contracts. These had their own signature and that of a witness and scribe in order to prove in court, if necessary. The prototype of this actually existed since the ancient Han dynasty, while contractual language became even more common and embedded into Chinese literary culture in later dynasties. The center of the political power of the Tang was the capital city of Chang in modern Xi'an, where the emperor maintained his large palace quarters and entertained political emissaries with music. The capital was also filled with incredible amounts of riches and resources to spare. When the Chinese prefectural government officials traveled to the capital in the year 643 to give the annual report of the affairs in their districts, Emperor Taizong discovered that many had no proper quarters to rest in and were renting rooms with merchants. Therefore, Emperor Taizong ordered the government agencies in charge of municipal construction to build every visiting official his own private mansion in the capital. Imperial examinations. Students of Confucian studies were candidates for the imperial examinations, which qualified their graduates for appointment to the local, provincial, and central government bureaucracies. 2 types of exams given: Mingjing, illuminating the classics, and Jinshi, presented scholar. The Mingjing was based upon the Confucian classics and tested the student's knowledge of a broad variety of texts. The Jinshi tested a student's literary abilities in writing essays in response to questions on governance and politics, as well as in composing poetry. Candidates were also judged on proper deportment, appearance, speech, and calligraphy, all subjective criteria that favored the wealthy over those of more modest means who were unable to pay tutors of rhetoric and writing. Although a disproportionate number of civil officials came from aristocratic families, wealth and noble status were not prerequisites, and the exams were open to all male subjects whose fathers were not of the artisan or merchant classes. To promote widespread Confucian education, the Tang government established state-run schools and issued standard versions of the 5 classics with commentaries. Open competition was designed to draw the best talent into government. But perhaps an even greater consideration for the Tang rulers was to avoid imperial dependence on powerful aristocratic families and warlords by recruiting a body of career officials having no family or local power base. The Tang law code ensured equal division of inherited property amongst legitimate heirs, encouraging social mobility by preventing powerful families from becoming landed nobility through primogeniture. The competition system proved successful, as scholar officials acquired status in their local communities while developing an esprit de corps that connected them to the imperial court. From Tang times until the end of the Qing dynasty in 1912, scholar officials served as intermediaries between the people and the government. Yet, the potential of a widespread examination system was not fully realized until the succeeding Song dynasty, when the merit-driven scholar official largely shed his aristocratic habits and defined his social status. The examination system, used only on a small scale in Sui and Tang times, played a central role in the fashioning of this new elite. The early Song emperors, concerned above all to avoid domination of the government by military men, greatly expanded the civil service examination system and the government school system. Religion and politics. From the outset, religion played a role in Tang politics. In his bid for power, Lai Yuan had attracted a following by claiming descent from the Taoism sage Lao Tzu, 6th century BC. People bidding for office would request the prayers of Buddhist monks, with successful aspirants making donations in return. Before the persecution of Buddhism in the 9th century, Buddhism and Taoism were both accepted. Religion was central in the reign of Emperor Xuanzong r. 712–756. The emperor invited Taoist and Buddhist monks and clerics to his court, exalted the Taoist ancient Lao Tzu with grand titles, wrote commentary on the Lao Tzu scriptures, and set up a school to prepare candidates for Taoist examinations. In 726 he called upon the Indian monk Vajrabhati 671–741 to perform tantric rites to avert a drought. In 742 he personally held the incense burner, while Amikavajra 705–774, patriarch of the Shingon school, recited mystical incantations to secure the victory of Tang forces. Emperor Xuanzong closely regulated religious finances. Near the beginning of his reign in 713, he liquidated the inexhaustible treasury of a prominent Buddhist monastery in Chang'an, which had collected vast riches as multitudes of anonymous repentants left money, silk, and treasure at its doors. Although the monastery used its funds generously, the emperor condemned it for fraudulent banking practices and distributed its wealth to other Buddhist and Taoist monasteries and to repair local statues, halls, and bridges. In 714 he forbade Chang'an shops from selling copied Buddhist sutras, giving a monopoly of this trade to the Buddhist clergy. Taxes and the census. The Tang dynasty government attempted to create an accurate census of the empire's population, mostly for effective taxation and military conscription. The early Tang government established modest grain and cloth taxes on each household, persuading households to register and provide the government with accurate demographic information. In the official census of 609, the population was tallied at 9 million households, about 50 million people, and this number did not increase in the census of 742. Patricia Ebry writes that notwithstanding census undercounting, China's population had not grown significantly since the earlier Han Dynasty, which recorded 58 million people in the year 2 SAM. Its head disagrees, estimating about 75 million people by 750. In the Tang census of 754, there were 1859 cities, 321 prefectures, and 1538 counties throughout the empire. Although there were many large and prominent cities, the rural and agrarian areas comprised some 80 to 90% of the population. There was also a dramatic migration from northern to southern China, as the north held 75% of the overall population at the dynasty's inception, which by its end was reduced to 50%. Chinese population would not dramatically increase until the Song dynasty, when it doubled to 100 million because of extensive rice cultivation. Military and foreign policy. Protectorates and tributaries. The 7th and first half of the 8th century are generally considered to be the era in which the Tang reached the zenith of its power. In this period, Tang control extended further west than any previous dynasty, stretching from North Vietnam in the south to a point north of Kashmir bordering Persia in the west to northern Korea in the northeast. Some of the kingdoms paying tribute to the Tang dynasty included Kashmir, Nepal, Khotan, Kuche, Kashgar, Silla, Champa, and kingdoms located in Amud Darya and Siddharya Valley. Turkic nomads addressed the emperor of Tang China as Tang Kehen. After the widespread Gokturk revolt of Shabalukhandi, 658 was put down at Issyk-Kul in 657 by Su Dingfang 5 1667 Emperor Gaozong established several protectorates governed by a protectorate general or grand protectorate general, which extended the Chinese sphere of influence as far as Herat in. Protectorate generals were given a great deal of autonomy to handle local crises without waiting for central admission. After Xuanzong's reign, military governors jiedushi were given enormous power, including the ability to maintain their own armies, collect taxes, and pass their titles on hereditarily. This is commonly recognized as the beginning of the fall of Tang's central government. Soldiers and conscription. By the year 737, Emperor Xuanzong discarded the policy of conscripting soldiers that were replaced every 3 years, replacing them with long-service soldiers who were more battle-hardened and efficient. It was more economically feasible as well, since training new recruits and sending them out to the frontier. By the late 7th century, the fuming troops began abandoning military service and the homes provided to them in the equal field system. The supposed standard of 100 mu of land allotted to each family was in fact decreasing in size in places where population expanded and the wealthy bought up most of the land. Hard-pressed peasants and vagrants were then induced into military service with benefits of exemption from both taxation and corvée labor service, as well as provisions for farmland and dwellings for dependents who accompanied soldiers on the frontier. By the year 742, the total number of enlisted troops in the Tang armies had risen to about 500,000 men. Eastern regions. In East Asia, Tang Chinese military campaigns were less successful elsewhere than in previous imperial Chinese dynasties. Like the emperors of the Sui dynasty before him, Taizong established a military campaign in 644 against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. In the Goguryeo-Tang War, however, this led to its withdrawal in the first campaign because they failed to overcome the successful defense led by General Yon Gisamun. Allying with the Korean Silla kingdom, the Chinese fought against Beich and their Yamato-Japanese allies in the Battle of Bikyang in August 663, a decisive Tang-Silla victory. The Tang dynasty navy had several different ship types at its disposal to engage in naval warfare. The Battle of Bikyang was actually a restoration movement by remnant forces of Beich, since their kingdom was toppled in 660 by a joint Tang-Silla invasion, led by Chinese General Su Dingfang and Korean General Kim Yushin 595–673. In another joint invasion with Silla, the Tang army severely weakened the Goguryeo kingdom in the north by taking out its outer forts in the year 645. With joint attacks by Silla and Tang armies under Commander Lai Shiji 594–669, the kingdom of Goguryeo was destroyed by 668. Although they were formerly enemies, the Tang accepted officials and generals of Goguryeo into their administration and military, such as the brothers Yon Namsing 634–679 and Yon Namsin 639–701. From 668 to 676, the Tang Empire would control northern Korea. However, in 671, Silla broke the alliance and began the Silla-Tang War to expel the Tang forces. At the same time, the Tang faced threats on its western border when a large Chinese army was defeated by the Tibetans on the Dafei River in 670. By 676, the Tang army was expelled out of Korea by unified Silla. Following a revolt of the Eastern Turks in 679, the Tang abandoned its Korean campaigns. Although the Tang had fought the Japanese, they still held cordial relations with Japan. There were numerous imperial embassies to China from Japan, diplomatic missions that were not halted until 894 by Emperor Yuda 887–897, upon persuasion by Sugawara no Michizane 845–903. The Japanese Emperor Tenmu R 672–686 even established his conscripted army on that of the Chinese model, his state ceremonies on the Chinese model, and constructed his palace at Fujiwara on the Chinese model of architecture. Many Chinese Buddhist monks came to Japan to help further the spread of Buddhism as well. Two 7th-century monks in particular, Jiayu and Jiayu, visited the court of Emperor Tenji R. This 3rd-century mechanically driven directional compass vehicle employing a differential gear was again reproduced in several models for Tenji in 666, as recorded in the Nihon Shoki of 720. Japanese monks also visited China. Such was the case with En in 794–864, who wrote of his travel experiences including travels along China's Grand Canal. The Japanese monk Enshin 814–891 stayed in China from 839 to 847 and again from 853 to 858, landing near Fuzhou, Fujian, and setting sail for Japan from Taizhou, Zhejiang during his second trip to China. Western and northern regions. The Sui and Tang carried out successful military campaigns against the steppe nomads. Chinese foreign policy to the north and west now had to deal with Turkic nomads, who were becoming the most dominant ethnic group. To handle and avoid any threats posed by the Turks, the Sui government repaired fortifications and received their trade and tribute missions. They sent 4 royal princesses to form marriage alliances with Turkic clan leaders in 597, 599, 614, and 617. The Sui stirred trouble and conflict amongst ethnic groups against the Turks. As early as the Sui dynasty, the Turks had become a major militarized force employed by the Chinese. When the Khitans began raiding northeast China in 605, a Chinese general led 20,000 Turks against them, distributing Khitan livestock and women to the Turks as a reward. On 2 occasions between 635 and 636, Tang royal princesses were married to Turk mercenaries or generals in Chinese service. Throughout the Tang dynasty, until the end of 755, there were approximately 10 Turkic generals serving under the Tang. While most of the Tang army was made of fuming Chinese conscripts, the majority of the troops led by Turkic generals were of non-Chinese origin, campaigning largely in the western frontier where the presence of fuming troops was low. Some Turkic troops were tribalized Han Chinese, Dizanicized people. Civil war in China was almost totally diminished by 626, along with the defeat in 628 of the Ordo's Chinese warlord Liang Shidu. After these internal conflicts, the Tang began an offensive against the Turks. In the year 630, Tang armies captured areas of the Ordos Desert, modern-day Inner Mongolia province, and southern Mongolia from the Turks. After this military victory, on June 11, 631, Emperor Taizong also sent envoys to the Xuantuo bearing gold and silk in order to persuade the release of enslaved Chinese prisoners who were captured during the transition from Sui to Tang from the northern frontier. This embassy succeeded in freeing 80,000 Chinese men and women who were then returned to China. While the Turks were settled in the Ordos region, former territory of the Xingnu, the Tang government took on the military policy of dominating the central steppe. Like the earlier Han dynasty, the Tang dynasty along with Turkic allies conquered and subdued Central Asia during the 640s and 650s. During Emperor Taizong's reign alone, large campaigns were launched against not only the Gok Turks, but also separate campaigns against the Taiyuan, the Oasis city-states, and the Xuantuo. Under Emperor Gaozong, a campaign led by the general Su Dingfang was launched against the Western Turks ruled by Ashurbanipal. The Tang Empire competed with the Tibetan Empire for control of areas in Inner and Central Asia, which was at times settled with marriage alliances such as the marrying of Princess Wenqing d. 680 to Songtsen Gampo d. 649. A Tibetan tradition mentions that Chinese troops captured Lhasa after Songtsen Gampo's death, but no such invasion is mentioned in either Chinese annals or the Tibetan manuscripts of Dunhuang. There was a long string of conflicts with Tibet over territories in the Tarim Basin between 670 and 692, and in 763, the Tibetans even captured the capital of China, Chang'an for 15 days during the An Lushan Rebellion. In fact, it was during this rebellion that the Tang withdrew its western garrisons stationed in what is now Gansu and Qinghai, which the Tibetans then occupied along with the territory of what is now Xinjiang. Hostilities between the Tang and Tibet continued until they signed a formal peace treaty in 821. The terms of this treaty, including the fixed borders between the two countries, are recorded in a bilingual inscription on a stone pillar outside the Jiakong Temple in Lhasa. During the Islamic conquest of Persia 633–656, the son of the last ruler of the Sassanid Empire, Prince Peroz and his court moved to Tang China. According to the Old Book of Tang, Peroz was made the head of a governorate of Persia in what is now Zaranj, Afghanistan. During this conquest of Persia, the Rashidun Caliph Uthman ibn Affan r. 644–656 sent an embassy to the Tang court at Chang'an. Arab sources claim Umayyad commander Qutayba ibn Muslim briefly took Kashgar from China and withdrew after an agreement, but modern historians entirely dismiss this claim. The Arab Umayyad Caliphate in 715 deposed Iqshid, the king of the Fergana Valley, and installed a new king Alutar on the throne. The deposed king fled to Kucha's seat of Anxi Protectorate and sought Chinese intervention. The Chinese sent 10,000 troops under Zhang Xiaosong to Fergana. He defeated Alutar and the Arab occupation force at Namangan and reinstalled Iqshid on the throne. The Tang dynasty Chinese defeated the Arab Umayyad invaders at the Battle of Aksu 717. The Arab Umayyad commander al-Yashkuri and his army fled to Tashkent after they were defeated. The Turkish then crushed the Arab Umayyads and drove them out. By the 740s, the Arabs under the Abbasid Caliphate in Khorasan had re-established a presence in the Fergana Basin and in Sogdiana. At the Battle of Talas in 751, Karluk mercenaries under the Chinese defected, helping the Arab armies of the Caliphate to defeat the Tang force under commander Gao Ziaji. Although the battle itself was not of the greatest significance militarily, this was a pivotal moment in history, as it marks the spread of Chinese papermaking into regions west of China as captured Chinese soldiers shared the technique of papermaking to the Arabs. These techniques ultimately reached Europe by the 12th century through Arab-controlled Spain. Although they had fought at Talas, on June 11, 758, an Abbasid embassy arrived at Chang'an simultaneously with the Uyghur Turks bearing gifts for the Tang Emperor. In 788–789, the Chinese concluded a military alliance with the Uyghur Turks, who twice defeated the Tibetans in 789 near the town of Gaicheng in Dzungaria and in 791 near Ningxia on the Yellow River. Joseph Needham writes that a tributary embassy came to the court of Emperor Taizong in 643 from the Patriarch of Antioch. However, Friedrich Hirth and other sinologists such as Sam. Edshead have identified Fulin in the Old and New Book of Tang as the Byzantine Empire, which those histories directly associated with Dakin, i.e. the Roman Empire. The embassy sent in 643 by Baduali Boduolai was identified as Byzantine ruler Constans Roman II Paganotos Constantinos Paganotos, or Constantine the Bearded, and further embassies were recorded as being sent into the 8th century. Sam. Edshead offers a different transliteration stemming from patriarch or patrician, possibly a reference to one of the acting regents for the young Byzantine monarch. The Old and New Book of Tang also provide a description of the Byzantine capital Constantinople, including how it was besieged by the Dashi, i.e. Umayyad Caliphate forces of Muawiyah I, who forced them to pay tribute to the Arabs. The 7th century Byzantine historian Theophylact Simicator wrote about the reunification of northern and southern China by the Sui dynasty, dating this to the time of Emperor Maurus, the capital city Kubdan from Old Turkic Kumdan, i.e. Chang'an, the basic geography of China including its previous political division around the Yangtze River, the name of China, economy, through use of the land trade along the Silk Road and maritime trade by sail at sea, the Tang were able to acquire and gain many new technologies, cultural practices, rare luxury, and contemporary items. From Europe, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, the Tang dynasty were able to acquire new ideas in fashion, new types of ceramics, and improved silversmithing techniques. The Tang Chinese also gradually adopted the foreign concept of stools and chairs as seating, whereas the Chinese beforehand always sat on mats placed on the floor. People of the Middle East coveted and purchased in bulk Chinese goods such as silks, lacquer wares, and porcelain wares. Songs, dances, and musical instruments from foreign regions became popular in China during the Tang dynasty. These musical instruments included oboes, flutes, and small lacquered drums from Kucha in the Tarim Basin, and percussion instruments from India such as cymbals. At the court there were 9 musical ensembles expanded from 7 in the Sui dynasty that played eclectic Asian music. There was great interaction with India, a hub for Buddhist knowledge, with famous travelers such as Xuanzang d. 664 visiting the South Asian state. After a 17-year-long trip, Xuanzang managed to bring back valuable Sanskrit texts to be translated into Chinese. There was also a Turkic Chinese dictionary available for serious scholars and students, while Turkic folk songs gave inspiration to some Chinese poetry. In the interior of China, trade was facilitated by the Grand Canal and the Tang government's rationalization of the Greater Canal system that reduced costs of transporting grain and other commodities. The state also managed roughly 32,100 km 19,900 mi of postal service routes by horse or boat. Silk Road. Although the Silk Road from China to Europe and the Western world was initially formulated during the reign of Emperor Wu 141–87 BC during the Han, it was reopened by the Tang in 639 when Hu Junji d. 643 conquered the West and remained open for almost 4 decades. It was closed after the Tibetans captured it in 678, but in 699, during Empress Wu's period, the Silk Road reopened when the Tang reconquered the 4 garrisons of Anxi originally installed in 640, once again connecting China directly to the west for land-based trade. The Tang captured the vital route through the Gilgit Valley from Tibet in 722, lost it to the Tibetans in 737, and regained it under the command of the Goguryeo-Korean general Gao Zhiji. When the An Lushan Rebellion ended in 763, the Tang Empire withdrew its troops from its western lands, allowing the Tibetan Empire to largely cut off China's direct access to the Silk Road. An internal rebellion in 848 ousted the Tibetan rulers, and Tang China regained its northwestern prefectures from Tibet in 851. These lands contained crucial grazing areas and pastures for raising horses that the Tang dynasty desperately needed. Despite the many expatriate European travelers coming into China to live and trade, many travelers, mainly religious monks and missionaries, recorded China's stringent immigrant laws. As the monk Xuanzang and many other monk travelers attested to, there were many Chinese government checkpoints along the Silk Road that examined travel permits into the Tang Empire. Furthermore, banditry was a problem along the checkpoints and oasis towns, as Xuanzang also recorded that his group of travelers were assaulted by bandits on multiple occasions. The Silk Road also affected Tang dynasty art. Horses became a significant symbol of prosperity and power as well as an instrument of military and diplomatic policy. Horses were also revered as a relative of the dragon. Seaports and maritime trade. Chinese envoys had been sailing through the Indian Ocean to states of India since perhaps the 2nd century BC, yet it was during the Tang dynasty that a strong Chinese maritime presence could be found in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, into Persia, Mesopotamia sailing up the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq, Arabia, Egypt in the Middle East, and Aksum, Ethiopia. During the Tang dynasty, thousands of foreign expatriate merchants came and lived in numerous Chinese cities. In 748, The Buddhist monk Jian Zhen described Guangzhou as a bustling mercantile business center where many large and impressive foreign ships came to dock. He wrote that many large ships came from Borneo, Persia, Queensland, Indonesia/Java, with spices, pearls, and jade piled up mountain high, as written in the jiedushi lost records of the state of Yu. Relations with the Arabs were often strained when the imperial government was attempting to quell the An Lushan Rebellion. Arab and Persian pirates burned and looted Canton on October 30, 758. The Tang government reacted by shutting the port of Canton down for roughly 5 decades. Thus, foreign vessels docked at Hanoi instead. However, when the port reopened, it continued to thrive. In 851, the Arab merchant Suleiman al-Tajir observed the manufacturing of Chinese porcelain in Guangzhou and admired its transparent quality. He also provided a description of Guangzhou's landmarks, granaries, local government administration, some of its written records, treatment of travelers, along with the use of ceramics, rice, wine, and tea. Their presence came to an end under the revenge of Chinese rebel Huang Ko in 878, who purportedly slaughtered thousands regardless of ethnicity. Huang's rebellion was eventually suppressed in 884. Vessels from neighboring East Asian states such as Silla and Balhae of Korea and the Hisan province of Japan were all involved in the Yellow Sea trade, which Silla dominated. After Silla and Japan reopened renewed hostilities in the late 7th century, most Japanese maritime merchants chose to set sail from Nagasaki towards the mouth of the Huai River in order to sail back to Japan in 838. The Japanese embassy to China procured 9 ships and 60 Korean sailors from the Korean wards of Jeju and Lianshui cities along the Huai River. It is also known that Chinese trade ships traveling to Japan set sail from the various ports along the coasts of Zhejiang and Fujian provinces. The Chinese engaged in large-scale production for overseas export by at least the time of the Tang. This was proven by the discovery of the Belitung shipwreck, a silt-preserved shipwrecked Arabian dhow in the Gaspar Strait near Belitung, which had 63,000 pieces of Tang ceramics, silver, and gold, including a changsha bowl inscribed with the date 16th day of the 7th month of the 2nd year of the Baali reign, or 826. Beginning in 785, the Chinese began to call regularly at Sofala on the East African coast in order to cut out Arab middlemen, with various contemporary Chinese sources giving detailed descriptions of trade in Africa. The official and geographer Jiadan 730–805 wrote of 2 common sea trade routes in his day, one from the coast of the Bohai Sea towards Korea, and another from Guangzhou through Malacca towards the Nicobar Islands, Sri Lanka, and India. In 863, the Chinese author Duan Qingshi d. 863 provided a detailed description of the slave trade, ivory trade, and ambergris trade in a country called Bobali, which historians suggest was Berber, in Somalia. In Fustat Old Cairo, Egypt, the fame of Chinese ceramics there led to an enormous demand for Chinese goods. Hence Chinese often traveled there. This continued into later periods such as Fatimid Egypt. From this time period, the Arab merchant Shlomo once wrote of his admiration for Chinese seafaring junks, but noted that their draft was too deep for them to enter the Euphrates River, which forced them to ferry passengers and cargo in small boats. Shlomo also noted that Chinese ships were often very large, with capacities up to 600–700 passengers. Culture and society. Art. Both the Sui and Tang dynasties had turned away from the more feudal culture of the preceding northern dynasties in favor of staunch civil Confucianism. The governmental system was supported by a large class of Confucian intellectuals selected through either civil service examinations or recommendations. In the Tang period, Taoism and Buddhism were commonly practiced ideologies that played a large role in people's daily lives. The Tang Chinese enjoyed feasting, drinking, holidays, sports, and all sorts of entertainment, while Chinese literature blossomed and was more widely accessible with new printing methods. Chang'an, the Tang capital. Although Chang'an was the capital of the earlier Han and Jin dynasties, after subsequent destruction in warfare, it was the Sui dynasty model that comprised the Tang-era capital. The roughly square dimensions of the city had 6 miles 10 km of outer walls running east to west, and more than 5 miles 8 km of outer walls running north to south. The royal palace, the Taiji Palace, stood north of the city's central axis. From the large Ming gates located mid-center of the main southern wall, a wide city avenue stretched from there all the way north to the central administrative city, behind which was the Chengqin Gate of the royal palace or imperial city. Intersecting this were 14 main streets running east to west, while 11 main streets ran north to south. These main intersecting roads formed 108 rectangular wards with walls and 4 gates each, and each ward filled with multiple city blocks. The city was made famous for this checkerboard pattern of main roads with walled and gated districts. Its layout even mentioned in one of Du Fu's poems. During the Heian period, the city of Heian Kyo, present-day Kyoto, of Japan, like many cities, was arranged in the checkerboard street grid pattern of the Tang capital and in accordance with traditional geomancy following the model of Chang'an. Of these 108 wards in Chang'an, 2 of them, each the size of 2 regular city wards, were designated as government-supervised markets, and other space reserved for temples, gardens, ponds, etc. Throughout the entire city, there were 111 Buddhist monasteries, 41 Taoist abbeys, 38 family shrines, 2 official temples, 7 churches of foreign religions, 10 city wards with provincial transmission offices, 12 major inns, and 6 graveyards. Some city wards were literally filled with open public playing fields or the backyards of lavish mansions for playing horse polo and Cuju Chinese soccer. In 662, Emperor Gaozong moved the imperial court to the Daming Palace, which became the political center of the empire and served as the royal residence of the Tang emperors for more than 220 years. The Tang capital was the largest city in the world at its time, the population of the city wards and its suburban countryside reaching 2 million inhabitants. The Tang capital was very cosmopolitan, with ethnicities of Persia, Central Asia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Tibet, India, and many other places living within. Naturally, with this plethora of different ethnicities living in Chang'an, there were also many different practiced religions, such as Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, among others. With the open access to China that the Silk Road to the west facilitated, many foreign settlers were able to move east to China, while the city of Chang'an itself had about 25,000 foreigners living within. Exotic green-eyed, blonde-haired, Tacharian ladies serving wine in agate and amber cups, singing and dancing at taverns attracted customers. If a foreigner in China pursued a Chinese woman for marriage, he was required to stay in China and was unable to take his bride back to his homeland, as stated in a law passed in 628 to protect women from temporary marriages with foreign envoys. Several laws enforcing segregation of foreigners from Chinese were passed during the Tang dynasty. In 779, the Tang dynasty issued an edict which forced Uyghurs in the capital, Chang'an, to wear their ethnic dress, stopped them from marrying Chinese females, and banned them from passing off as Chinese. Chang'an was the center of the central government, the home of the imperial family, and was filled with splendor and wealth. However, incidentally, it was not the economic hub during the Tang dynasty. The city of Yangzhou along the Grand Canal and close to the Yangtze River was the greatest economic center during the Tang era. Yangzhou was the headquarters for the Tang government's salt monopoly and was the greatest industrial center of China. It acted as a midpoint in shipping of foreign goods that would be organized and distributed to the major cities of the north. Much like the seaport of Guangzhou in the south, Yangzhou boasted thousands of foreign traders from all across Asia. There was also the secondary capital city of Luoying, which was the favored capital of the two by Empress Wu. In the year 691, she had more than 100,000 families, more than 500,000 people from around the region of Chang'an moved to populate Luoying instead. With a population of about 1 million, Luoying became the second largest city in the empire, and with its close proximity to the Luo River it benefited from southern agricultural fertility and trade traffic of the Grand Canal. However, the Tang court eventually demoted its capital status and did not visit Luoying after the year 743, when Chang'an's problem of acquiring adequate supplies and stores for the year was solved. As early as 736, granaries were built at critical points along the route from Yangzhou to Chang'an, which eliminated shipment delays, spoilage, and pilfering. An artificial lake used as a transshipment pool was dredged east of Chang'an in 743, where curious northerners could finally see the array of boats found in southern China, delivering tax and tribute items to the imperial court. Literature. The Tang period was a golden age of Chinese literature and art. Over 48,900 poems penned by some 2,200 Tang authors have survived to the present day. Skill in the composition of poetry became a required study for those wishing to pass imperial examinations, while poetry was also heavily competitive. Poetry contests amongst guests at banquets and courtiers were common. Poetry styles that were popular in the Tang included gushi and jiedushi, with the renowned poet Li by 701–762 famous for the former style, and poets like Wang Wei 701–761 and Kui Hao 704–754 famous for their use of the latter. Jiedushi poetry, or regulated verse, is in the form of 8-line stanzas or 7 characters per line, with a fixed pattern of tones that required the second and third couplets to be antithetical, although the antithesis is often lost in translation to other languages. Tang poems remained popular, and great emulation of Tang-era poetry began in the Song dynasty. In that period, Yan Yu, active 1194–1245, was the first to confer the poetry of the High Tang c. 713–766 era with canonical status within the classical poetic. Yan Yu reserved the position of highest esteem among all Tang poets for Du Fu 712–770, who was not viewed as such in his own era and was branded by his peers as an anti-traditional rebel. The classical prose movement was spurred in large part by the writings of Tang authors Liu Zhongyu in 773–819 and Han Yu 768–824. This new prose style broke away from the poetry tradition of the Paiantuan Paiantai Wen parallel prose style begun in the Han Dynasty. Although writers of the classical prose movement imitated Paiantuan, they criticized it for its often vague content and lack of colloquial language, focusing more on clarity and precision to make their writing more direct. This skew and archaic prose style can be traced back to Han Yu and would become largely associated with orthodox Neo-Confucianism. Short story fiction and tales were also popular during the Tang, one of the more famous ones being Yingying's biography by Yuan Zhen 779–831, which was widely circulated in his own time, and by the Yuan dynasty 1279–1368 became the basis for plays in Chinese opera. Timothy C. Wang places this story within the wider context of Tang love tales, which often share the plot designs of quick passion, inescapable societal pressure leading to the abandonment of romance, followed by a period of melancholy. Wang states that this scheme lacks the undying vows and total self-commitment to love found in Western romances such as Romeo and Juliet, but that underlying traditional Chinese values of inseparableness of self from one's environment, including human society, served to create the necessary fictional device of romantic tension. There were large encyclopedias published in the Tang. The Yuan Leiju Encyclopedia was compiled in 624 by the chief editor Aoyingzun 557–641, as well as Linghu Defen 582–666 An 635. The Encyclopedia Treatise on Astrology of the Kaiyuan era was fully compiled in 729 by Gautama Siddha Fl. 8th century, an ethnic Indian astronomer, astrologer, and scholar born in the capital Chang'an. Chinese geographers such as Jia Dan wrote accurate descriptions of places far abroad. In his work written between 785 and 805, he described the sea route going into the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and that the medieval Iranians, whom he called the people of Luohi, had erected ornamental pillars in the sea that acted as lighthouse beacons for ships that might go astray. Confirming Jaya's reports about lighthouses in the Persian Gulf, Arabic writers a century after Jaya wrote of the same structures, writers such as al-Masyudi and al-Muqaddasi. The Tang dynasty Chinese diplomat Wang Xuanzi traveled to Magadha, modern northeastern India, during the 7th century. Afterwards, he wrote the book Zhangtianju Guitu illustrated accounts of central India, which included a wealth of geographical information. Many histories of previous dynasties were compiled between 636 and 659 by court officials during and shortly after the reign of Emperor Taizong of Tang. These included the Book of Liang, Book of Chen, Book of Northern Kai, Book of Zhu, Book of Sui, Book of Jin, History of Northern Dynasties, and the History of Southern Dynasties. Although not included in the official 24 histories, the Tangdian and Tang Huiyao were nonetheless valuable written historical works of the Tang period. The Shitang, written by Liu Zhaiji in 710, was a meta-history, as it covered the history of Chinese historiography in past centuries until his time. The Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, compiled by Bianji, recounted the journey of Xuanzang, the Tang era's most renowned Buddhist monk. Other important literary offerings included Duan Chengshi's d. 863 miscellaneous morsels from Yangyang, an entertaining collection of foreign legends and hearsay, reports on natural phenomena, short anecdotes, mythical and mundane tales, as well as notes on various subjects. The exact literary category or classification that Duan's large informal narrative would fit into is still debated amongst scholars and historians. Religion and philosophy. Since ancient times, some Chinese had believed in folk religion and Taoism that incorporated many deities. Practitioners believed the Tao and the afterlife was a reality parallel to the living world, complete with its own bureaucracy and afterlife currency needed by dead ancestors. Funerary practices included providing the deceased with everything they might need in the afterlife, including animals, servants, entertainers, hunters, homes, and officials. This ideal is reflected in Tang dynasty art. This is also reflected in many short stories written in the Tang about people accidentally winding up in the realm of the dead, only to come back and report their experiences. Buddhism, originating in India around the time of Confucius, continued its influence during the Tang period and was accepted by some members of imperial family, becoming thoroughly Sinicized and a permanent part of Chinese traditional culture. In an age before Neo-Confucianism and figures such as Yu Zai 1130–1200, Buddhism had begun to flourish in China during the Northern and Southern dynasties and became the dominant ideology during the prosperous Tang. Buddhist monasteries played an integral role in Chinese society, offering lodging for travelers in remote areas, schools for children throughout the country, and a place for urban literati to stage social events and gatherings such as going-away parties. Buddhist monasteries were also engaged in the economy, since their land property and serfs gave them enough revenues to set up mills, oil presses, and other enterprises. Although the monasteries retained serfs, these monastery dependents could actually own property and employ others to help them in their work, including their own slaves. The prominent status of Buddhism in Chinese culture began to decline as the dynasty and central government declined as well during the late 8th century to 9th century. Buddhist convents and temples that were exempt from state taxes beforehand were targeted by the state for taxation. In 845, Emperor Wu Zhou of Tang finally shut down 4,000 600 Buddhist monasteries along with 40,000 temples and shrines, forcing 260,000 Buddhist monks and nuns to return to secular life. This episode would later be dubbed one of the four Buddhist persecutions in China. Although the ban would be lifted just a few years after, Buddhism never regained its once dominant status in Chinese culture. This situation also came about through a revival of interest in native Chinese philosophies such as Confucianism and Taoism. Hanyu 786–824, who Arthur F. Wright stated was a brilliant polemicist and ardent xenophobe, was one of the first men of the Tang to denounce Buddhism. Although his contemporaries found him crude and obnoxious, he would foreshadow the later persecution of Buddhism in the Tang, as well as the revival of Confucian theory with the rise of Neo-Confucianism of the Song dynasty. Nonetheless, Chan Buddhism gained popularity amongst the educated elite. There were also many famous Chan monks from the Tang era, such as Ma Zhudiyi Beijing and Huangbo Ziyan. The sect of Pure Land Buddhism, initiated by the Chinese monk Huiyu in 334–416, was also just as popular as Chan Buddhism during the Tang. Rivaling Buddhism was Taoism, a native Chinese philosophical and religious belief system that found its roots in the Tao Te Ching, a text attributed to a 6th century BC figure named Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi. The ruling Lai family of the Tang dynasty actually claimed descent from the ancient Lao Tzu. On numerous occasions where Tang princes would become crown prince or Tang princesses taking vows as Taoist priestesses, their lavish former mansions would be converted into Taoist abbeys and places of worship. Many Taoists were associated with alchemy in their pursuits to find an elixir of immortality and a means to create gold from concocted mixtures of many other elements. Although they never achieved their goals in either of these futile pursuits, they did contribute to the discovery of new metal alloys, porcelain products, and new dyes. The historian Joseph Needham labeled the work of the Taoist alchemists as proto-science rather than pseudoscience. However, the close connection between Taoism and alchemy, which some sinologists have asserted, is refuted by Nathan Sivin, who states that alchemy was just as prominent, if not more so, in the secular sphere and practiced more often by laymen. The Tang dynasty also officially recognized various foreign religions. The Assyrian Church of the East, otherwise known as the Nestorian Church or the Church of the East in China, was given recognition by the Tang court. In 781, the Nestorian stele was created in order to honor the achievements of their community in China. A Christian monastery was established in Shaanxi province, where the Dakin Pagoda still stands, and inside the pagoda there is Christian-themed artwork. Although the religion largely died out after the Tang, it was revived in China following the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. Although the Sogdians had been responsible for transmitting Buddhism to China from India during the 2nd to 4th centuries, soon afterwards they largely converted to Zoroastrianism due to their links to Sassanid Persia. Sogdian merchants and their families living in cities such as Chang'an, Luoyang, and Xianying usually built a Zoroastrian temple once their local communities grew larger than 100 households. Sogdians were also responsible for spreading Manichaeism in Tang China and the Uyghur Khaganate. The Uyghurs built the first Manichaean monastery in China in 768, yet in 843 the Tang government ordered that the property of all Manichaean monasteries be confiscated in response to the outbreak of war with the Uyghurs. With the blanket ban on foreign religions 2 years later, Manichaeism was driven underground and never flourished in China again. Leisure. Much more than earlier periods, the Tang era was renowned for the time reserved for leisure activity, especially for those in the upper classes. Many outdoor sports and activities were enjoyed during the Tang, including archery, hunting, horse polo, kuju soccer, cockfighting, and even tug-of-war. Government officials were granted vacations during their tenure in office. Officials were granted 30 days off every 3 years to visit their parents if they lived 1,000 mi 1,600 km away, or 15 days off if the parents lived more than 167 mi 269 km away, travel time not included. Officials were granted 9 days of vacation time for weddings of a son or daughter, and either 5-3 or 1 day/day off for the nuptials of close relatives, travel time not included. Officials also received a total of 3 days off for their sons' capping initiation right into manhood, and 1 day off for the ceremony of initiation right of a close relative's son. Traditional Chinese holidays such as Chinese New Year, Lantern Festival, Cold Food Festival, and others were universal holidays. In the capital city of Chang'an, there was always lively celebration, especially for the Lantern Festival, since the city's nighttime curfew was lifted by the government for 3 days straight. Between the years 628 and 758, the imperial throne bestowed a total of 69 grand carnivals nationwide, granted by the emperor in the case of special circumstances such as important military victories, abundant harvests after a long drought or famine, the granting of amnesties, the installment of a new crown prince, etc. For special celebration in the Tang era, lavish and gargantuan-sized feasts were sometimes prepared, as the imperial court had staffed agencies to prepare the meals. This included a prepared feast for 1,100 elders of Chang'an in 664, a feast for 3,500 officers of the Divine Strategy Army in 768, and a feast for 1,200 women of the palace and members of the imperial family in the year 826. Drinking wine and alcoholic beverages was heavily ingrained into Chinese culture, as people drank for nearly every social event. A court official in the 8th century allegedly had a serpentine-shaped structure called the ale grotto, built with 50,000 bricks on the ground floor that each featured a bowl from which his friends could drink. Status in clothing. In general, garments were made from silk, wool, or linen depending on your social status and what you could afford. Furthermore, there were laws that specified what kinds of clothing could be worn by whom. The color of the clothing also indicated rank. During this period, China's power, culture, economy, and influence were thriving. As a result, women could afford to wear loose-fitting, wide-sleeved garments. Even lower-class women's robes would have sleeves 4 to 5 feet in width. Position of women. Concepts of women's social rights and social status during the Tang era were notably liberal-minded for the period. However, this was largely reserved for urban women of elite status, as men and women in the rural countryside labored hard in their different set of tasks, with wives and daughters responsible for more domestic tasks of weaving textiles and rearing of silkworms, while men tended to farming in the fields. There were many women in the Tang era who gained access to religious authority by taking vows as Taoist priestesses. The headmistresses of high-class courtesans in the north hamlet of the capital Chang'an acquired large amounts of wealth and power. Said courtesans, who likely influenced the Japanese geishas, were well respected. These courtesans were known as great singers and poets, supervised banquets and feasts, knew the rules to all the drinking games, and were trained to have the utmost respectable table manners. Although they were renowned for their polite behavior, the courtesans were known to dominate the conversation among elite men, and were not afraid to openly castigate or criticize prominent male guests who talked too much or too loudly, boasted too much of their accomplishments, or had in some way ruined dinner for everyone by rude behavior. On one occasion, a courtesan, when singing to entertain guests, courtesans not only composed the lyrics to their own songs, but they popularized a new form of lyrical verse by singing lines written by various renowned and famous men in Chinese history. It was fashionable for women to be full-figured or plump. Men enjoyed the presence of assertive, active women. The foreign horse riding sport of polo from Persia became a wildly popular trend among the Chinese elite, and women often played the sport as glazed earthenware figurines from the time period portrait. The preferred hairstyle for women was to bunch their hair up like an elaborate edifice above the forehead. A law was passed in 671 which attempted to force women to wear hats with veils again in order to promote decency, But these laws were ignored as some women started wearing caps and even no hats at all, as well as men's riding clothes and boots, and tight-sleeved bodices. There were some prominent court women after the era of Empress Wu, such as Yang Guifei 719–756, who had Emperor Xuanzong appoint many of her relatives and cronies to important ministerial and martial positions. Cuisine. During the earlier northern and southern dynasties 420–589, and perhaps even earlier, the drinking of tea Camellia sinensis became popular in southern China. Tea was viewed then as a beverage of tasteful pleasure and with pharmacological purpose as well. During the Tang dynasty, tea became synonymous with everything sophisticated in society. The poet Lu Tong 790–835 devoted most of his poetry to his love of tea. The 8th century author Lu Yu, known as the Sage of Tea, even wrote a treatise on the art of drinking tea, called the Classic of Tea. Although wrapping paper had been used in China since the 2nd century BC, during the Tang dynasty the Chinese were using wrapping paper as folded and sewn square bags to hold and preserve the flavor of tea leaves. This followed many other uses for paper, such as the first recorded use of toilet paper made in 589 by the scholar official Yan Jitui 531–591, confirmed in 851 by an Arab traveler who remarked that Tang Chinese lacked cleanliness because they relied on toilet paper instead of washing themselves with water. In ancient times, the Chinese had outlined the 5 most basic foodstuffs known as the 5 grains: sesamum, legumes, wheat, panicled millet, and glutinous millet. The Ming Dynasty encyclopedist Song Yingxing 1587–1666 noted that rice was not counted amongst the 5 grains from the time of the legendary and deified Chinese sage Shennong, the existence of whom because the properly wet and humid climate in southern China for growing rice was not yet fully settled or cultivated by the Chinese. Song Yingxing also noted that in the Ming Dynasty 7/10 of civilians' food was rice. During the Tang Dynasty, rice was not only the most important staple in southern China, but had also become popular in the north where central authority resided. During the Tang Dynasty, wheat replaced the position of millet and became the main staple crop. As a consequence, wheat cake shared a considerable amount in the staple of Tang. There were 4 main kinds of cake: steamed cake, boiled cake, pancake, and hu cake. Steamed cake was consumed commonly by both civilians and aristocrats. Like ragamo in modern Chinese cuisine, steamed cake was usually stuffed with meat and vegetables. Shops and packmen regularly sold inexpensive steamed cake on the streets of Chang'an. Boiled cake was the staple of the northern dynasties, and it kept its popularity in the Tang dynasty. It included a wide variety of dishes similar to modern wonton, noodles, and many other kinds of food that soak wheat in water. While aristocrats favored wonton, civilians usually consumed noodles and noodle slice soup that were easier to produce. Pancakes was rare in China before the Tang, when it gained popularity. Food shops in Tang cities such as Chang'an commonly sold both pancakes and dumplings. Wu cake, which means foreign cake, was extremely popular during the Tang. Wu cake was toasted in the oven, covered with sesame seeds, and served at taverns, inns, and shops. Japanese Buddhist monk Enin observed that hu cake was popular among all of China's civilians. During the Tang, the many common foodstuffs and cooking ingredients, in addition to those already listed, were barley, garlic, salt, turnips, soybeans, pears, apricots, peaches, apples, pomegranates, jujubes, rhubarb, hazelnuts, pine nuts, chestnuts, walnuts, yams, taro, etc. The various meats that were consumed included pork, chicken, lamb especially preferred in the north, sea otter, bear, which was hard to catch, but there were recipes for steamed, boiled, and marinated bear, and even Bactrian camels. In the south along the coast, meat from seafood was by default the most common, as the Chinese enjoyed eating cooked jellyfish with cinnamon, Sichuan pepper, cardamom, and ginger, as well as oysters with wine, fried squid with ginger and vinegar, horseshoe crabs and red swimming crabs, shrimp and pufferfish, which the Chinese called river piglet. From the trade overseas and overland, the Chinese acquired peaches from Samarkand, date palms, pistachios, and figs from Greater Iran, pine nuts and ginseng roots from Korea, and mangoes from Southeast Asia. In China, there was a great demand for sugar during the reign of Harsha over North India. R. 606–647 Indian envoys to the Tang brought two makers of sugar who successfully taught the Chinese how to cultivate sugarcane. Cotton also came from India as a finished product from Bengal, although it was during the Tang that the Chinese began to grow and process cotton, and by the Yuan dynasty it became the prime textile fabric in China. Some foods were also off limits, as the Tang court encouraged people not to eat beef. This was due to the role of the bull as a valuable working animal. From 831 to 833, Emperor Wenzong of Tang even banned the slaughter of cattle on the grounds of his religious convictions to Buddhism. Methods of food preservation were important and practiced throughout China. The common people used simple methods of preservation, such as digging deep ditches and trenches, brining and salting their foods. The emperor had large ice pits located in the parks in and around Chang'an for preserving food, while the wealthy and elite had their own smaller ice pits. Each year, the emperor had laborers carve 1,000 blocks of ice from frozen creeks in mountain valleys, each block with the dimension of 3 ft 0.91 m by 3 ft by 3.5 ft 1.1 m. Frozen delicacies, such as chilled melon, were enjoyed during the summer. Science and technology. Engineering. Technology during the Tang period was built also upon the precedents of the past. Previous advancements in clockworks and timekeeping included the mechanical gear systems of Zhang 78–139 and Ma Jian Fl. 3rd century, which gave the Tang mathematician, mechanical engineer, astronomer, and Mun Qizing 683–727 inspiration when he invented the world's first clockwork escapement mechanism. This was used alongside a clepsydra clock and water wheel to power a rotating armillary sphere in representation of astronomical observation. Yixing's device also had a mechanically timed bell that was struck automatically every hour, and a drum that was struck automatically every quarter hour, essentially a striking clock. Yixing's astronomical clock and water-powered armillary sphere became well known throughout the country, since students attempting to pass the imperial examinations by 730 had to write an essay on the device as an exam requirement. However, the most common type of public and palace timekeeping device was the inflow clepsydra. Its design was improved c. 610 by the Sui dynasty engineers Zhengzun and Yuan Kai. They provided a steelyard balance that allowed seasonal adjustment in the pressure head of the compensating tank, and could then control the rate of flow for different lengths of day and night. There were many other mechanical inventions during the Tang era. These included a 3 ft 0.91 m tall mechanical wine server of the early 8th century that was in the shape of an artificial mountain, carved out of iron and rested on a lacquered wooden tortoise frame. This intricate device used a hydraulic pump that siphoned wine out of metal dragon-headed faucets, as well as tilting bowls that were timed to dip wine down by force of gravity when filled into an artificial lake that had intricate iron leaves popping up as trays for placing party treats. Furthermore, as the historian Charles Benn describes it, midway up the southern side of the mountain was a dragon. The beast opened its mouth and spit brew into a goblet seated on a large iron lotus leaf beneath. When the cup was 80% full, the dragon ceased spewing ale, and a guest immediately seized the goblet. If he was slow in draining the cup and returning it to the leaf, the door of a pavilion at the top of the mountain opened, and a mechanical wine server dressed in a cap and gown emerged with a wooden bat in his hand. As soon as the guest returned the goblet, the dragon refilled it, the wine server withdrew, and the doors of the pavilion closed. A pump siphoned the ale, that flowed into the ale pool through a hidden hole and returned the brew to the reservoir holding more than 16 quarts/15 liters of wine inside the mountain. Yet, the use of a teasing mechanical puppet in this wine-serving device wasn't exactly a novel invention of the Tang, since the use of mechanical puppets in China date back to the Qin dynasty 221–207 BC. In the 3rd century, Ma Jun had an entire mechanical puppet theater operated by the rotation of a water wheel. There was also an automatic wine server known in the ancient Greco-Roman world, a design of the Greek inventor Heron of Alexandria that employed an urn with an inner valve and a lever device similar to the one described above. There are many stories of automatons used in the Tang, including General Yang Wulian's wooden statue of a monk who stretched his hands out to collect contributions. When the number of coins reached a certain weight, the mechanical figure moved his arms to deposit them in a satchel. This weight and lever mechanism was exactly like Heron's penny slot machine. Other devices included one by Wang Zhu, whose wooden otter could allegedly catch fish. Needham suspects a spring trap of some kind was employed here. In the realm of structural engineering and technical Chinese architecture, there were also government standard building codes, outlined in the early Tang book of the Yingxinling National Building Law. Fragments of this book have survived in the Tanglu, the Tang Code, while the Song Dynasty Architectural Manual of the Yingzhou Fashi State Building Standards by Li Jai 1065–1101 in 1103 is the oldest existing technical treatise on Chinese architecture that has survived. During the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang 712–756, there were 34,850 registered craftsmen serving the state, managed by the Agency of Palace Buildings Jingzuo Jian. Woodblock printing. Woodblock printing made the written word available to vastly greater audiences. One of the world's oldest surviving printed documents is a miniature Buddhist Dharani Sutra unearthed at Xi'an in 1974 and dated roughly from 650 to 670. The Diamond Sutra is the first full-length book, printed at regular size, complete with illustrations embedded with the text and dated precisely to 868. Among the earliest documents to be printed were Buddhist texts as well as calendars, the latter essential for calculating and marking which days were auspicious and which days were not. With so many books coming into circulation for the general public, literacy rates could improve, along with the lower classes being able to obtain cheaper sources of study. Therefore, there were more lower-class people seen entering the imperial examinations and passing them by the later Song dynasty. Although the later Bai Sheng's movable type printing in the 11th century was innovative for his period, woodblock printing that became widespread in the Tang would remain the dominant printing type in China until the more advanced printing press from Europe became widely accepted and used in East Asia. The first use of the playing card during the Tang dynasty was an auxiliary invention of the new age of printing. Cartography. In the realm of cartography, there were further advances beyond the map makers of the Han dynasty. When the Tang Chancellor Peiju 547–627 was working for the Sui dynasty as a commercial commissioner in 605, he created a well-known gridded map with a graduated scale in the tradition of Peiju 224–271. The Tang Chancellor Zhu Jingzong 592–672 was also known for his map of China drawn in the year 658. In the year 785, the Emperor Dezong had the geographer and cartographer Jia Dan 730–805 complete a map of China and her former colonies in Central Asia. Upon its completion in 801, the map was 9.1 30 ft in length and 10 33 ft in height, mapped out on a grid scale of 1 inch equaling 100 Li Chinese unit of measuring distance. A Chinese map of 1137 is similar in complexity to the one made by Jia Dan, carved on a stone stele with a grid scale of 100 Li. However, the only type of map that has survived from the Tang period are star charts. Despite this, the earliest extant terrain maps of China come from the ancient state of Qin, maps from the 4th century BC that were excavated in 1986. Medicine. The Chinese of the Tang era were also very interested in the benefits of officially classifying all of the medicines used in pharmacology. In 657, Emperor Gaozong of Tang R. 649–683 commissioned the literary project of publishing an official Materia Medica, complete with text and illustrated drawings for 833 different medicinal substances taken from different stones, minerals, metals, plants, herbs, animals, vegetables. In addition to compiling pharmacopoeias, the Tang fostered learning in medicine by upholding imperial medical colleges, state examinations for doctors, and publishing forensic manuals for physicians. Authors of medicine in the Tang include Zhen Chuan-di 643 and Sun Simiao 581–682. The former, who first identified in writing that patients with diabetes had an excess of sugar in their urine, and the latter, who was the first to recognize that diabetic patients should avoid consuming alcohol and starchy foods. As written by Zhen Chuan and others in the Tang, the thyroid glands of sheep and pigs were successfully used to treat goiters. Thyroid extracts were not used to treat patients with goiter in the West until 1890. The use of the dental amalgam manufactured from tin and silver was first introduced in the medical text Xingxiu Benkao written by Xu Gong in 659. Alchemy, gas cylinders, and air conditioning. Chinese scientists of the Tang period employed complex chemical formulas for an array of different purposes, often found through experiments of alchemy. These included a waterproof and dust-repelling cream, or varnish for clothes and weapons, fireproof cement for glass and porcelain wares, a waterproof cream applied to silk clothes of underwater divers, a cream designated for polishing bronze mirrors, and many other useful formulas. The vitrified, translucent ceramic known as porcelain was invented in China during the Tang, although many types of glazed ceramics preceded it. Ever since the Han Dynasty 202 BC, during the Tang Dynasty, a gazetteer of Sichuan province stated that at one of these 182 and 600 FT fire wells, men collected natural gas into portable bamboo tubes, which could be carried around for dozens of km and still produce a flame. These were essentially the first gas cylinders. Robert Temple assumes some sort of tap was used for this device. The inventor Ding Huanfeng, 180 AD of the Han Dynasty, invented a rotary fan for air conditioning, with 7 wheels 3 m 10 ft in diameter and manually powered. In 747, Emperor Xuanzong had a cool hall built in the Imperial Palace, which the Tang Yulin describes as having water-powered fan wheels for air conditioning, as well as rising jet streams of water from fountains. During the subsequent Song Dynasty, written sources mentioned the air conditioning rotary fan as even more widely used. Historiography. The first classic work about the Tang is the Old Book of Tang by Liu Zhu 887–946 et al. Of the later Jin, who redacted it during the last years of his life. This was edited into another history labeled the New Book of Tang in order to distinguish it, which was a work by the Song historian Zhao Yingziu 1007–1072, Song Kai 998–1061, et al. Of the Song Dynasty between the years 1044 and 1060. Both of them were based upon earlier annals, yet those are now lost. Both of them also rank among the 24 histories of China. One of the surviving sources of the Old Book of Tang, primarily covering up to 756, is the Tangdian, which Du Yu presented to the emperor in 801. The Tang period was again placed into the enormous universal history text of the Zizhai Tangjian, edited, compiled, and completed in 1084 by a team of scholars under the Song Dynasty Chancellor Sima Guang 1019–1086. This historical text, written with 3 million Chinese characters in 294 volumes, covered the history of China from the beginning of the Warring States 403 BC until the beginning of the Song Dynasty 960.